The group home sat at the end of a quiet street where the streetlights flickered, and the sidewalks had cracks running through them like old scars. It was a brick building with chipped paint and windows that never seemed to let in enough sunlight. Inside those walls lived 12 children who had one thing in common. None of them had a family to call their own. Among them was a 9-year-old boy named Caleb. He had dark brown eyes that always seemed to be looking at something far away. His clothes were a little too big for his thin frame because they were hand-me-downs from older kids who had already left the system. He kept to himself most of the time. The other children had stopped trying to be his friend years ago, not because he was mean or rude, but because he had built walls around himself so high that no one could climb over them. Caleb had been in the foster care system since he was 4 years old. His mother had left him at a hospital one cold winter night and never came back. He waited for her for 3 days before the nurses finally called social services. He still remembered sitting by the window of the hospital room, watching every car that pulled into the parking lot, hoping one of them would be hers. She never came. Since then, he had been moved from one foster home to another. 7 homes in 5 years. Some families were kind but could not afford to keep him. Others were strict and treated him like a problem that needed to be fixed. One family returned him after just 2 weeks because they said he was too quiet, and it made them uncomfortable. Each time he was sent back, a little piece of his heart broke off and disappeared. By the time he arrived at the group home on Maple Street, there was not much left. The caretakers at the home were not cruel, but they were tired. They had too many children to look after, and not enough hours in the day. They made sure everyone had food on the table and a bed to sleep in. But they did not have time for bedtime stories or warm hugs. Caleb understood this. He stopped expecting anything more. But there was one thing that kept him going. One secret that nobody else knew about. It happened during his first week at the group home. He was exploring the basement where old donations were stored. Broken toys, torn books, and forgotten clothes filled the dusty shelves. And there, buried under a pile of winter coats, he found it. A small electronic keyboard. It was scratched and worn. Some of the keys were sticky, and the speaker crackled when he turned it on. But when Caleb pressed one of the keys, a sound came out. A single note. Clear and simple. Something about that sound made his chest feel lighter. He had never played an instrument before. He had never even touched one. But from that moment on, the keyboard became his most treasured possession. Every night, after the lights went out and the other children were asleep, Caleb would sneak down to the basement. He would sit on an old wooden crate, place the keyboard on his lap, and teach himself to play. He had no teacher, no music books, and no videos to watch. He simply listened to songs on the old radio in the common room and tried to copy what he heard. At first, it was terrible. His fingers stumbled over the keys, and the sounds he made were messy and wrong. But he did not give up. Night after night, he practiced. His small fingers slowly learned where to go. His ears became sharper. After a few months, he could play entire melodies without making a single mistake. Music became his escape. When he played, he was not the forgotten boy that nobody wanted. He was not the kid with the too big clothes and the sad eyes. He was free. The notes he created told stories that he could never say out loud. They carried his pain, his loneliness, and the tiny spark of hope he still kept hidden deep inside. But he never told anyone about it. He was afraid that if the caretakers found out, they would take the keyboard away. He was afraid the other children would laugh at him. Most of all, he was afraid that if he shared this one beautiful thing, it would somehow be ruined. So he kept it to himself, locked away like a precious secret. The years passed slowly. Caleb watched as other children came and went. Some were adopted by smiling couples who arrived with teddy bears and promises of new bedrooms. Others were placed in foster homes and never came back. Each time someone left, the remaining children would press their faces against the window and wave goodbye. Caleb never waved. He just watched. He told himself he did not care. He told himself that families were for other kids, not for him. He told himself that being alone was safer, because if you did not let anyone in, no one could hurt you. But late at night, when he played his keyboard in the dark basement, the music told a different story. It spoke of a little boy who still dreamed of someone calling his name with love in their voice. It whispered about birthday cakes with candles and bedtime stories and someone saying goodnight instead of just turning off the lights. He was 9 years old now. In the world of adoption, that was almost too old. Most couples wanted babies or toddlers, cute little ones they could raise from the beginning. Nobody wanted a quiet, serious 9-year-old with a file full of paperwork and a heart full of scars. Caleb knew this. He had heard the caretakers talking about it when they thought no one was listening. So when a new couple arrived at the group home one Tuesday afternoon, he did not even bother to look up. He was sitting in his usual corner of the common room, knees pulled up to his chest, fingers tapping silently against his leg. It was something he did without thinking now. His fingers were always playing invisible songs. Even when there was no keyboard in front of him, the couple walked through the door with bright smiles and hopeful eyes. The woman had kind features and soft brown hair that fell past her shoulders. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a warm face. They looked like the type of people who belonged in picture frames, the type of people who had happy families and nice homes. They spoke with the caretakers first. Then they were introduced to the children one by one. The other kids put on their best behavior. They smiled and answered questions politely, each of them silently hoping to be the one who was chosen. Caleb stayed in his corner. He did not smile. He did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor and his fingers tapping against his knee. He had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago, but what he did not know was that his life was about to change forever. And it all started with a simple question from a stranger who saw something in him that no one else ever had. The couple's names were Thomas and Grace. They had been married for 12 years and had spent the last 3 of those years trying to start a family. When they learned they could not have children of their own, they made a decision that changed everything. They would open their hearts and their home to a child who needed them. Thomas had grown up in the foster care system himself. He knew what it felt like to be passed over, to watch other kids leave while he stayed behind. He remembered the cold nights in unfamiliar beds and the hollow feeling of not belonging anywhere. But he had been one of the lucky ones. A music teacher named Mr. Bernard had taken him under his wing when he was 11 years old. That man had changed his life forever. Music had saved Thomas. It gave him purpose, confidence, and eventually, a career. Now, he and Grace ran a small music academy on the other side of town. They taught piano, violin, and guitar to children from all backgrounds. Their studio was filled with laughter and melodies every single day. When they decided to adopt, they did not have a checklist of what they wanted. They were not looking for a perfect child. They were looking for a connection, a feeling, something that told them, this is the one. They had visited many orphanages and group homes over the past year. They had met dozens of children. Some were loud and energetic. Some were shy and polite. But each time, something felt incomplete. Thomas could not explain it. He just knew that he had not found the child he was meant to raise. Until today. When Thomas and Grace walked into the group home on Maple Street, they were greeted by the usual scene. Children lined up with hopeful faces. Caretakers offering coffee and paperwork. A tour of the building that showed clean rooms and shared spaces. But Thomas was not paying attention to the tour. His eyes had landed on a boy sitting alone in the corner of the common room. The boy was small for his age, with messy dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. He was not looking at the visitors. He was not smiling or waving like the other children. He sat with his knees pulled up, staring at the floor, completely lost in his own world, and his fingers were moving. Thomas noticed it right away. The boy's fingers were tapping against his knee in a pattern. Not random tapping. There was rhythm to it, structure. It was the kind of movement Thomas had seen 1,000 times before in his students. The boy was playing music that only he could hear. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest. He leaned over to Grace and whispered, "Do you see that boy in the corner?" Grace followed his gaze. Her expression softened when she saw the lonely figure sitting apart from everyone else. "He looks so sad," she said quietly. "He is playing something," Thomas said. "Watch his fingers." Grace watched for a moment, and her eyes widened. You are right. He is. Do you think he plays an instrument? I do not know, Thomas replied. But I need to talk to him. The caretaker, a tired woman with gray streaks in her hair, noticed where they were looking. She let out a small sigh. That is Caleb, she said. He has been with us for about 2 years now. Quiet boy. Keeps to himself. Does not really connect with the other children, or with visitors. Has anyone ever shown interest in adopting him? Grace asked. The caretaker hesitated. A few couples have tried to talk to him over the years, but he pushes everyone away. He has been through a lot. 7 foster homes before he came here. I think he has just given up on the idea of having a family. Thomas felt a familiar ache in his heart. He knew that feeling too well. May I speak with him? He asked. The caretaker shrugged. You can try, but do not expect much. Thomas walked slowly toward the corner where Caleb sat. Grace stayed behind, watching with hopeful eyes. The other children whispered among themselves, curious about why the tall man was approaching the boy nobody ever noticed. Caleb did not look up when Thomas stopped in front of him. Hey there, Thomas said gently. Mind if I sit with you for a minute? No response. Caleb's fingers stopped moving, but he kept his eyes fixed on the floor. Thomas sat down on the worn carpet a few feet away from the boy. He did not push. He did not ask questions right away. He simply sat in silence, letting Caleb get used to his presence. After a long moment, Thomas spoke again. I saw your fingers moving just now. You were playing something, were you not? Caleb's body tensed. For a second, fear flashed across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by a hard, defensive expression. I do not know what you are talking about, he muttered. Thomas smiled softly. It is okay. I am not here to make fun of you. I am a musician. I run a music school with my wife. I know what it looks like when someone hears music in their head. Caleb finally looked up. His dark eyes met Thomas's for the first time. There was suspicion in them, but also something else. A tiny flicker of curiosity. Why do you care? Caleb asked. His voice was rough, like he was not used to talking. Because I was like you once, Thomas said honestly. I grew up without a family too. I spent years in homes, just like this one. And the only thing that kept me going was music. Caleb stared at him. He did not say anything, but he did not look away either. Thomas continued. Someone gave me a chance when I was about your age. A teacher who believed in me when I did not believe in myself. That chance changed my whole life. Good for you, Caleb said flatly, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Grace had quietly walked over and was now standing beside Thomas. She knelt down so she was at eye level with Caleb. We are not here to force you into anything, she said softly. We just wanted to meet you. There is something special about you. I can see it. Caleb looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. There is nothing special about me, he said. I am just a kid nobody wants. The words hit Thomas like a punch to the chest. He remembered saying those exact same words when he was young. He remembered the hopelessness, the belief that he would never be good enough. Thomas took a deep breath. He knew what he was about to say was unusual, maybe even crazy. But something in his gut told him it was right. I heard there is an old piano in the main hall of this building, Thomas said. The caretaker mentioned it during the tour. She said nobody ever uses it. Caleb's eyes flickered with something. Recognition. Interest. Then he quickly looked away. Thomas leaned in slightly. Here is what I am thinking. If you can play something on that piano, anything at all, my wife and I will adopt you. We will take you home and give you a real family. The room seemed to freeze. Grace looked at Thomas with wide eyes, but she did not object. She trusted him. Caleb stared at Thomas like he had just grown a second head. You are joking, he said. I never joke about music, Thomas replied, or about family. I have never played piano in my life, Caleb lied quickly. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Thomas held his gaze. Maybe. Maybe not. But I saw your fingers. I know talent when I see it. So here is your chance, Caleb. One song. That is all I am asking. The other children had gathered nearby, whispering and giggling. Some of them laughed out loud. Caleb cannot play anything, one boy said. He is just the weird kid who hides in corners. Caleb's face burned with shame. But Thomas did not move. He did not laugh. He just kept looking at Caleb with steady, patient eyes. You do not have to decide right now, Thomas said. We will come back in 3 days. If you want to take the chance, we will be here. He stood up and offered his hand to Grace. Together, they walked toward the door. Just before they left, Thomas looked back one more time. Caleb was still sitting in the corner. But now, his hands were trembling. And for the first time in years, there was something new in his eyes. It was fear. But underneath the fear, buried so deep that even Caleb did not recognize it yet, was hope. That night, Caleb could not sleep. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while the other boys in the room snored softly around him. The moonlight crept through the thin curtains and cast pale shadows across the walls. Everything was quiet, but inside Caleb's mind, a storm was raging. He kept hearing Thomas's voice over and over again. If you can play something on that piano, anything at all, my wife and I will adopt you. The words felt impossible. They felt like a trick. In Caleb's experience, good things did not happen to kids like him. Promises were made and broken. Hope was something that only led to pain. He had learned this lesson the hard way. There was a family once, when he was 6 years old. A nice couple with a big backyard and a golden dog. They told him he could stay forever. They bought him new shoes and let him pick out his own cereal at the grocery store. For 3 wonderful months, Caleb thought he had finally found a home. Then one day, they sat him down and explained that things were not working out. They said it was not his fault. They said they were sorry. A week later, a social worker came to pick him up, and Caleb never saw them again. After that, he stopped believing in forever. So why would this time be any different? Thomas and Grace seemed kind. They seemed genuine, but so had all the others. And every single time, Caleb had ended up back where he started, alone. He turned onto his side and squeezed his eyes shut. Maybe he should just ignore the whole thing. Maybe he should stay in his corner when they came back and pretend the conversation never happened. It was safer that way. If he did not try, he could not fail. If he did not hope, he could not be hurt. But then another thought crept into his mind. What if this was real? What if Thomas actually meant what he said? What if this was the one chance Caleb had been waiting for his entire life? He thought about his keyboard hidden in the basement. He thought about all those nights spent teaching himself to play, pouring his heart into melodies that no one else had ever heard. Music was the only thing that had ever made him feel alive, the only thing that made him feel like he was worth something, and now someone was asking him to share it. The fear was suffocating. What if he was not good enough? What if he sat down at that piano and his fingers froze? What if everyone laughed at him? And Thomas and Grace realized they had made a mistake. Caleb pulled the thin blanket over his head and tried to make his thoughts stop. But they would not. They kept spinning and spinning until his chest felt tight and his eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, Caleb moved through the day like a ghost. He ate his breakfast without tasting it. He sat through the group activities without hearing a word. The other children whispered about him and pointed, still laughing about the strange offer the tall man had made. Caleb thinks he is going to get adopted, one boy sneered. As if anyone would want him. He probably cannot even play chopsticks, another kid added. Caleb ignored them. He had heard worse. Words could not hurt him anymore. At least, that was what he told himself. But deep down, every insult landed like a stone in his stomach. That evening, after dinner, Caleb made a decision. He waited until the lights went out and the hallways grew quiet. Then he slipped out of bed and crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky steps. But instead of going to the basement where his keyboard was hidden, he turned toward the main hall. The piano was there, sitting in the corner like a sleeping giant. Caleb had seen it many times before. It was old and dusty, with chipped wood and yellowed keys. Nobody ever played it. The caretakers said it was out of tune, and there was no money to fix it. It had become just another forgotten thing in a building full of forgotten children. But tonight, it looked different. Tonight, it looked like a door to another life. Caleb walked toward it slowly. His bare feet made no sound on the cold wooden floor. When he reached the piano, he stood there for a long moment, just staring at it. His heart was beating so fast he could feel it in his throat. He had never played a real piano before. His little keyboard had tiny plastic keys that barely made a sound. This was something else entirely. This was the real thing. Slowly, carefully, he sat down on the bench. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. He placed his trembling hands on the keys, feeling the smooth ivory under his fingertips. It was cold at first, but something about the touch felt right, like coming home. He pressed one key. The sound that filled the room made his breath catch. It was deep and rich, so much fuller than anything his keyboard had ever produced. The note hung in the air like a living thing, vibrating through his chest and echoing off the walls. Caleb pressed another key, then another. Before he knew it, he was playing. At first, his fingers stumbled. The keys were bigger than he was used to, and the spacing was different. But slowly, muscle memory took over. The countless hours of practice in the basement began to pay off. His hands remembered what to do even when his brain was frozen with fear. He played one of the songs he had taught himself, a slow, sad melody that he had pieced together from bits of music he had heard on the radio. It was not a famous song. It was not something anyone would recognize. It was just his. As he played, something inside him began to crack open. All the pain he had been carrying for years started to pour out through his fingers. The loneliness of being unwanted. The grief of losing his mother before he ever really had her. The fear of hoping and being crushed again. All of it flowed into the music, transforming into something beautiful. Tears streamed down Caleb's face, but he did not stop playing. For the first time in his life, he was not hiding. He was not pretending. He was letting someone hear the real him, even if that someone was only the empty room around him. When the last note faded into silence, Caleb sat very still. His hands were shaking. His cheeks were wet. But somewhere deep inside, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt brave. He stayed at the piano for hours that night, practicing until his fingers ached and his eyes grew heavy. He played the same song over and over, making it better each time. He added new parts and smoothed out the rough edges. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, he had turned his simple melody into something truly special. It was not just a song anymore. It was his story. As he finally crept back to bed, exhausted but strangely peaceful, Caleb made a decision. He was going to do it. He was going to sit down at that piano in front of Thomas and Grace and everyone else, and he was going to play. Not because he was sure it would work, not because he believed they would really adopt him, but because for once in his life, he wanted to try. He wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worth choosing. 2 more days. That was all the time he had. Caleb closed his eyes and let sleep finally take him. And for the first time in years, he dreamed of something other than being alone. He dreamed of a home. The morning of the 3rd day arrived too quickly. Caleb woke up with his stomach twisted into knots. He had barely eaten anything the day before, and sleep had come in short, restless bursts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the piano. Every time his mind wandered, he heard the echo of his own music playing over and over again. Today was the day. Thomas and Grace would be coming back. And Caleb had to make a choice. He could hide in his corner like he always did, and let this chance slip away. Or he could walk up to that piano and risk everything. The thought made him feel like he was going to be sick. He got dressed slowly, pulling on his cleanest shirt and trying to flatten his messy hair with his hands. It did not help much, but he tried anyway. He wanted to look presentable. He wanted to look like someone worth choosing. Breakfast was a blur. The other children talked and laughed around him, but their voices sounded far away, like they were coming from underwater. Caleb pushed his food around his plate and stared at the table, lost in his own thoughts. "Nervous about your big performance?" one of the boys asked with a smirk. Caleb did not answer. He did not even look up. I bet he chickens out, another kid whispered loudly. He is too scared to do anything. The words stung, but Caleb forced himself to ignore them. He had bigger things to worry about. The hours crawled by like they were moving through mud. Caleb sat in the common room, watching the clock on the wall tick slowly forward. Every minute felt like an hour. Every second felt like a lifetime. And then, just after lunch, the front door opened. Thomas walked in first, wearing a warm smile and a brown jacket. Grace followed close behind, her eyes already scanning the room. When she spotted Caleb sitting in his usual corner, her face lit up with gentle hope. They came back, Caleb thought. They actually came back. Part of him had been convinced they would not show up. Part of him had expected this to be just another broken promise, another disappointment to add to the long list. But here they were, standing in the doorway, looking at him like he mattered. The head caretaker, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, greeted them at the door. She exchanged a few quiet words with Thomas and Grace, then turned to look at Caleb. "Well," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "It seems our visitors are here for you, Caleb." They said something about a piano? Every head in the room turned toward him. Caleb felt his face flush red. His hands started to tremble. For a moment, he thought about running. He thought about bolting out of the room and hiding in the basement where no one could find him. But then he looked at Thomas. The man was watching him with calm, steady eyes. There was no pressure in his gaze. No judgment, just patience. And something else that Caleb could not quite name. Something that looked almost like belief. Slowly, Caleb stood up. His legs felt like they were made of jelly. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. But he forced himself to walk forward, one step at a time, until he was standing in the middle of the room. "I will do it," he said quietly. His voice came out scratchy and weak, but the words were clear enough. A murmur rippled through the room. The other children exchanged surprised glances. Even Mrs. Patterson raised her eyebrows. "Are you sure?" Grace asked gently. Caleb nodded. He did not trust himself to speak again. Thomas smiled. "Then let us go to the main hall." The walk to the main hall felt like the longest journey of Caleb's life. Word had spread quickly through the group home, and by the time they arrived, a small crowd had gathered. Children of all ages lined the walls, whispering and pointing. A few of the caretakers stood near the back, their arms crossed, watching with curious expressions. The piano sat in the corner, waiting. It looked even bigger than Caleb remembered. The black wood gleamed softly in the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. The keys seemed to stretch on forever, white and black, full of possibility and danger. Caleb's mouth went dry. He walked toward the piano on shaky legs. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he finally reached the bench, he stood there for a moment, just staring at the instrument that held his entire future. Behind him, someone snickered. "This is going to be embarrassing," a voice whispered. Caleb closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought about all the nights he had spent in the basement, teaching himself to play on a broken keyboard. He thought about the music that had kept him company when no one else would. He thought about the song he had created, the one that held all his pain and all his hope wrapped together in a single melody. This was his moment, his one chance. He sat down on the bench. The room fell silent. Caleb placed his hands on the keys. They were trembling badly now. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into his back. He could hear his own breathing, loud and uneven in the quiet room. For one terrible second, his mind went completely blank. He could not remember the song. He could not remember how it started, or where his fingers were supposed to go. Panic surged through his chest like ice water, but then he thought of Thomas's words. "Someone gave me a chance when I was about your age. That chance changed my whole life." Caleb let out a slow breath. He stopped thinking about the people watching him. He stopped worrying about what would happen if he failed. He stopped being afraid. Instead, he just played. The first note rang out clear and true. It hung in the air for a moment, pure and beautiful. Then Caleb's fingers began to move. and the music poured out of him like water breaking through a dam. The melody started soft and sad. It spoke of lonely nights and empty hallways. It whispered about a little boy who waited by a hospital window, watching for a mother who never came. The notes were gentle at first, hesitant, like someone afraid to speak too loudly. But then the music began to change. It grew stronger, deeper. The sadness was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Determination, courage, hope. Caleb's fingers danced across the keys, faster and more confident with each passing moment. The song built and swelled, filling the room with sound that seemed too big to come from one small boy. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Grace had tears streaming down her face. Her hand was pressed against her mouth, and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Thomas stood beside her, completely still, his eyes fixed on Caleb with an expression of pure wonder. Even the children who had mocked Caleb were silent now. Their smirks had faded. Their whispers had stopped. They simply stood and listened, caught up in something they did not fully understand but could feel deep in their bones. Caleb played like his life depended on it. Because, in a way, it did. The final part of the song was the most beautiful. The melody soared upward, bright and hopeful, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It spoke of new beginnings and second chances. It spoke of a future that might actually be worth dreaming about. When the last note finally faded into silence, Caleb let his hands fall to his sides. He sat there, breathing hard, afraid to turn around. Afraid to see disappointment in the eyes of the people behind him. Afraid that it had not been enough. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then the room exploded into applause. It started with Thomas, clapping slowly and steadily. Then Grace joined in, her cheeks still wet with tears. One by one, the caretakers and children began to clap too, until the entire room was filled with the sound of hands coming together. Caleb finally turned around, and what he saw made his heart stop. Thomas was walking toward him with tears in his eyes. The tall, strong man who had seemed so composed was now crying openly. Without shame, he reached the piano and knelt down so that he was at eye level with Caleb. That, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Caleb did not know what to say. He did not know if he could say anything. His throat was too tight, and his eyes were burning with tears he could no longer hold back. Grace appeared beside Thomas, her warm hand resting gently on Caleb's shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." And for the first time in his life, Caleb believed that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The applause slowly faded, but the warmth in the room remained. Caleb sat frozen on the piano bench, unable to move, unable to think. His whole body was shaking. The tears he had been holding back for years were now falling freely down his cheeks, and he did not have the strength to wipe them away. Thomas was still kneeling in front of him, his own eyes red and wet. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed too small for what had just happened. Then Thomas reached out and gently placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice soft but steady. "What you just did was incredible. Truly incredible. But that is not why we are going to adopt you." Caleb blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Thomas smiled through his tears. "We would have come back for you even if you could not play a single note. Even if you had sat at that piano and nothing came out. We did not make that offer because we wanted a child who could perform. We made it because we wanted you to believe in yourself." The words hit Caleb like a wave. Grace knelt down beside her husband, her gentle eyes meeting Caleb's. "We saw something special in you the first day we walked into this place," she said. "Not because of your talent, because of your heart. The way you sat alone in that corner. The way you protected yourself from getting hurt again. We recognized that. We understood it. We just needed you to take a chance," Thomas added. "We needed you to see what we already saw. That you are worth fighting for. That you deserve to be loved." Caleb's chest felt like it was breaking open. All the walls he had spent years building were crumbling down, and he did not know how to stop them. He did not know if he wanted to stop them. "You really want me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Even though I am difficult? Even though I push people away?" Thomas laughed softly. "Kid, I was exactly like you. Ask anyone who knew me back then. I was angry, scared, and convinced that nobody would ever want me. But someone took a chance on me anyway. And now, it is my turn to do the same." He opened his arms. Caleb hesitated for just a second. A lifetime of rejection and disappointment told him to hold back, to protect himself, to not trust this moment. But then he looked at Thomas and Grace. He looked at their open arms and their tear-streaked faces and the love shining in their eyes, and he let go. He fell forward into Thomas's embrace, burying his face against the man's chest. Thomas wrapped his arms around him tightly, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. Grace joined them, her arms encircling both of them, creating a circle of warmth that Caleb had never known before. For the first time in his life, Caleb felt what it was like to be held by a family. He cried harder than he had ever cried before. Great, heaving sobs that shook his entire body. All the pain and loneliness and fear came pouring out of him. And Thomas and Grace held him through every second of it. They did not let go. They did not pull away. They simply held him and let him feel everything he had been keeping locked inside. The other children watched in silence. Some of them had tears in their own eyes. Even the ones who had made fun of Caleb seemed moved by what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson stood near the back of the room, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. When Caleb finally lifted his head, his face was blotchy, and his eyes were swollen. But for the first time in years, he was smiling. "Does this mean I get to go home with you?" he asked quietly. Thomas grinned. "It means you are already home, kid. The paperwork is just a formality." The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings and documents and social workers asking questions. But true to his word, Thomas pushed through every obstacle and cut through every piece of red tape. Grace was by his side the whole time, patient and determined, never wavering in her commitment. And finally, on a sunny afternoon in early spring, Caleb walked out of the group home on Maple Street for the last time. He carried a small bag with his few belongings. His clothes, a worn toothbrush, and the old electronic keyboard that had started it all. He had asked Mrs. Patterson if he could keep it, and she had smiled and said yes without hesitation. Thomas loaded the bag into the car while Grace helped Caleb into the back seat. As they drove away, Caleb turned to look out the rear window. The brick building grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared from view. He was leaving behind the only life he had ever known. But for the first time, he was not afraid. He was going home. The house was more beautiful than anything Caleb had ever imagined. It had a red front door and big windows that let in lots of sunlight. There was a garden in the backyard, with flowers just starting to bloom, and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. But the best part was inside. In the living room, right next to the fireplace, sat a brand new piano. It was sleek and black and polished to a perfect shine. When Caleb saw it, he stopped in the doorway and stared. "That is yours," Grace said softly. Thomas picked it out himself. Caleb looked up at Thomas, his eyes wide. "For me?" Thomas nodded. "Every musician needs a proper instrument. Consider it a welcome home gift." Caleb walked over to the piano slowly, running his fingers along the smooth wood. He sat down on the bench and pressed a single key. The sound that came out was pure and clear, more beautiful than any note he had ever heard. He looked back at Thomas and Grace, standing together in the doorway of their home, his home. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." 1 year later, Caleb stood backstage at the city concert hall. He was wearing a new suit that Grace had picked out for him. His hair was neatly combed, and his shoes were polished until they shone. He looked like a different person from the scared little boy who used to hide in corners, but inside, he was still the same Caleb. Just happier. Just loved. The past year had been the best of his life. He had started taking real piano lessons at Thomas and Grace's music academy. He had made friends for the first time. He had learned what it meant to sit down at a dinner table with people who actually wanted to hear about his day. He had learned what it meant to have a family. And now he was about to perform his original composition in front of hundreds of people. The piece had a name now. He called it Found. Thomas appeared beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Nervous," he admitted. "But the good kind of nervous." Thomas smiled. "That means you are ready." From somewhere in the auditorium, Caleb heard the announcer's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our youngest performer tonight. He is 10 years old, and he will be playing an original composition called Found. Please give a warm welcome to Caleb." Accompanied by his proud parents, Thomas and Grace, the curtain began to rise. Caleb walked out onto the stage, his heart pounding but his steps steady. The bright lights blinded him for a moment, but then his eyes adjusted. He could see the audience stretching out before him, hundreds of faces, all watching, all waiting. And in the front row, right in the center, sat Thomas and Grace. They were holding hands and smiling up at him with so much pride and love that it made his chest ache in the best possible way. Caleb sat down at the grand piano. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar, cool ivory beneath his fingertips. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The lonely nights in the basement, the broken keyboard, the fear and the doubt and the pain. And then the chance, the one chance that had changed everything. He began to play. The music filled the concert hall, rich and powerful and full of emotion. It told the story of a boy who had been lost and alone. A boy who had built walls around his heart to keep from getting hurt. A boy who had finally found the courage to let someone in. And as the final notes rang out and the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause, Caleb smiled. He was not the forgotten boy anymore. He was found.